everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Kristen Burke, and I am the co-chair of the Young Members Committee here at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of our literary and young members committees, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, a conversation with the amazing writer, Douglas Stuart, who just won the 2020 Booker Prize for his stunning debut novel, Shuggie Bain. Today's conversation will once again be led by skilled moderator and host of Page Turner's reading series, Glenn Rauscher. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Glenn. Please enjoy the event.
Kristen, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to join you here. My name is Glenn Rauscher, the host of the Page Turner's reading series, formerly the Half King reading series. First, want to say thank you to the National Arts Club, to Kate and Nadine, and to John Mark Bowling and Grove Press and PGW. It's a Tuesday night, hopefully at the tail end of the pandemic. And even with all those limitations, we know, everyone involved with this event, that there's 10,000 different places that you could choose to be. And no one involved in bringing this event to you tonight takes for granted that you've chosen to be here with us. So thank you for that. Your reward is to have an evening with the author of Shuggie Bain, Douglas Stuart. We want you to be a part of this, as Kristen mentioned. We want you to have questions. If you do, please put them in the Q&A folder at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We cannot get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. And please note, if I don't choose your question, it is not personal. We will also not get to all 154 of my questions either. Books are available for sale. There is a link posted in the chat. They're available from Books on Call NYC, New York's only exclusively off-site bookseller, now handling these at-home events. And if you do purchase a book, we will be able to get you, courtesy of the author, a signed book plate to affix to your book at a later time. The book will come first, the book plate second, and we'll ask you to do the labor of affixing. All formats are available. And you know, if someone visits you at home and they see Shuggie Bain on your shelf, they know that you have real cachet. And please do remember, New York City has a 2-book minimum. And now on to our featured author. One of my favorite quotations is, "Great art is never depressing. Bad art always is." The subtext, of course, is regardless of subject matter. With Shuggie Bain, Douglas Stuart has given us a story with much darkness, but without false notes. Takes us and the characters he's created through challenges and depths, and bright, oft too briefly redemptive moments, and connects us completely with them all, no matter for how long they're on the page, from a momentary appearance to, of course, the remarkable family at the center of the story. Much of what holds the reader is the exquisite language, not just the specifics of the Glaswegian dialect, but finely wrought, never labored prose, read out loud to the other person in the room, funny, poetic, memorable. Paragraph after paragraph of perfect phrases to communicate character and story and never once distract. For a story with so much darkness, the language itself creates pure joy. You find yourself emotionally entwined with the whole family, but especially Shuggie himself, as he navigates circumstances that no boy of any age should have to. By the final extraordinary choice he has to make, you are with him completely, caring for him, worrying over him, and wanting him to find some peace and happiness. He is a singular, extraordinary and unforgettable character. To take a story about alcoholism, family fracture, poverty, loss, and the eternal pain of being a misfit, and make it something that at the end leaves a reader completely exhilarated is one heck of a feat. But it is indeed what happens with this book. Please join me in welcoming Douglas Stuart.
Thank you, Glenn. What an introduction. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in tonight and spending your Tuesday night with us.
Thank you very much for doing this. I think the first thing I'd love to do, if your game, is to give people a little taste of what this book sounds and feels like. So I think you've got something to read for us.
Yeah, it's a very short reading, but this is when we meet our protagonist, our mother at the heart of the story, Agnes Bain, and she is living in the Sighthill tower blocks, which actually used to stand right in the centre of Glasgow. And she is looking around at her life and starting to chafe a little bit. Agnes Bain pushed her toes into the carpet and leaned out as far as she could into the night air. The damp wind kissed her flushed neck and pushed down inside her dress. It felt like a stranger's hand, a sign of living, a reminder of life. With a flick, she watched her cigarette dout fall, the glowing embers dancing 16 floors down onto the dark forecourt. She wanted to show the city this claret velvet dress. She wanted to feel a little envy from strangers, to dance with men who held her proud and close. Mostly, she wanted to take a good drink, to live a little. With a stretch of her calves, she leaned her hip bone on the window frame and let go of the ballast of her toes. Her body tipped down towards the amber city lights and her cheeks flushed with blood. She reached her arms out to the lights, and for a brief moment she was flying. No one noticed the flying woman. She thought about tilting further then, dared herself to do it. How easy it would be to kid herself that she was flying until it became only falling and she broke herself on the concrete below. The high-rise flat she still shared with her mother and father pressed in against her. Everything in the room behind her felt so small, so low-ceilinged and stifling. Payday to mass day, a life bought on tick, with nothing that ever felt owned outright. To be 39 and have her husband and her 3 children all crammed together in her mammy's flat gave her a feeling of failure. Him, her man, who when he shared her bed now seemed to lie on the very edge, made her feel angry with the littered promises of better things. Agnes wanted to put her foot through it all, or to scrape it back like it was spoilt wallpaper, to get her nail under it, and to rip it all away. Thank you.
Thank you for that. When you began this story, I think this is a fairly typical starter question. How did it start? How did you envision it going, and how did it wind up different from what you expected when you started it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, when I started, I wouldn't allow myself to imagine that I was writing a book. And so it began as just writing, and I wrote the scenes out of chronological order. Actually, the very first chapter that I wrote was with the brothers Shuggie and Leek, chapter 13, I think it is, going scrapping for copper on the coalface. And I'm quite a visual thinker and I'm quite a visual writer because I come actually from a visual arts background and not actually from an MFA for writers. And so when I could envision a chapter, when I could really step inside it myself and smell it and feel it and knew what was going to happen, then I would commit it to the page and really recreate that world. But the book came out of, the first draft came out of chronological order, chapter 13, then chapter 23, and then back to chapter 1. And what really surprised me about the first draft was that it ended up actually being 900 pages. Or if you formatted it for a book, it would actually be about 16 to 1800 pages. Because I was just enjoying the writing of it. And I didn't have the discipline of, or the need to try and sort of tailor it into a book. And so I wrote what I felt.
I was going to say what was the biggest challenge in the writing, but that may be part of the answer. That the thing that gave you joy was the thing that probably later caused some pain. Were there things that you eventually had to let go of that were particularly painful to let go of?
I think they were painful in the moment, but over the long run, I didn't miss them as much. Some of the best advice I ever received was actually from my editor, and he just said, as much as we can keep the lens on Shuggie and Agnes, I think that's easier for the reader to follow the story. Now, that lay a little bit at conflict and odds for me because I was wanting to write this working class story. And sometimes when you write a working class story, the joy of it is that the characters are going through this shared moment together. There is really a strong chorus, you know, people are living in very similar houses, having similar wages, going through the similar effects of the Thatcher years. And so I wanted to keep pulling in these voices and sharing them. But I found even with things that I would discard, even if the character ended up only being on the page for 2 or 3 pages, the writing about them in the first instance, where they were maybe 20 pages originally, was great research for me to understand and to try and empathize with them. So I think it was just a necessary part of the journey.
You mentioned the shared economic world, the shared world that they lived in. At one point in the book, you write, the women all had men at home, men rotting into the settee for want of decent work. What was the economic world that these characters lived in, and how did it affect the family unit?
Yeah, well, first of all, Glasgow is an incredibly vibrant, creative, compassionate city. And it was a real economic powerhouse all the way through the 19th and the 20th century. But by about the 1960s and 70s, first of all, the city was entirely reorganized, where they pulled down a lot of tenements and then thinned out the population to housing estates, or housing schemes as we would call them. But very quickly, cheaply built housing that actually then, as we know, looking back now, feel like projects or feel like places that weren't taking into account how humans would live. But then also for a city that was so focused on heavy industry, steel and coal and shipbuilding and railway car manufacturing, all of the industry failed and then lacked the support of the Thatcher government in the 70s and 80s. And so the unemployment in the city within the working class communities went to about 26 or 27%. And then it stayed there for a generation. And so this is the backdrop of how I come of age. You know, this is what I see my father and my brothers go through, and my uncles. And, you know, I come from a long line of tradesmen, people who put their faith in learning a skill and then making a decent living for their family. And that was all really swept out from underneath them, much like the decline you would see in a place like Appalachia or, you know, Detroit, or to put it into context for some American listeners.
So that it's, you mentioned a lot coming from a long line of tradesmen, and both Casey and Jean have already posted the question, and they do, it is a question that gets asked a lot, but I think it's, they say you've opened the door. How much of the book is a book taken at least in part from your experience? How much of it is pure imagination, or would you rather not say?
You know, it's something that I'm not sure I'm able to say. So what I always say to readers is that actually Shuggie and I have a very similar upbringing. I was raised on government benefits. I am the youngest son of a single mother. I am queer, growing up in the patriarchy, and my mother suffered with addiction from my earliest memories till she succumbed to that addiction when I was 16. So I lost my mother very early. And so when I write about poverty, or I write about loss or grief or coping with a parent with addiction, or just what it meant to be a feminine soul in a masculine world, I write about those things from the inside. What I wouldn't want a reader to do is to look at any of the specific scenes and then say, oh, Shuggie is, you know, going through something that Douglas went through. And in fact, Shuggie isn't me. Shuggie is a character of fiction, because my childhood, I was entirely shook. And I was entirely sort of just shunted from situation to situation without being able to process any of it. And Shuggie actually is quite a little character. I mean, he's very precocious. Oftentimes he's in complete command of his situation, especially when he's dealing with adults around him. And I never had that. That's the spirit of The Staircase, I think.
Do you think that Shuggie's ability to kind of shapeshift is a coping mechanism for the real suffering that he experiences?
Yeah, I think what I wanted to write about is, we often in literature, children or characters face one issue, or they're sort of like put upon, maybe there's addiction at home, or maybe they're coming of age for queerness. And I wanted to show that actually some kids don't have a safe harbor anywhere. Shuggie doesn't have any peace at school, nor does he have any peace at home. And so he's dealing with more than just his queerness, or more than his mother's addiction. He's trying to find his, you know, his way to the future, and his ability to belong where he is. And so shapeshifting is a really important part of that for him. He's, from my own experience, I know that, you know, I wanted Shuggie to be dealing with concealing a lot of things. And he's concealing his queerness, you know, he's concealing the shame of addiction at home. Agnes teaches him to conceal poverty. And part of that's about self-worth and it's about pride, but it's also about shame he feels about some of these things.
One of the things that that comes across so well in the book is just how awful kids can be to each other. It's extremely visceral in the book. In the story, where does that come from, and how does it manifest in relation to Shuggie trying to get along in the world of other children specifically?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm often asked is that sort of like queer homophobia something that was really bad in Glasgow at the time? And I always say to someone, was it great in Naples? Was it great in Detroit? Like, you know what I mean? It's like a context. People read the book and think it's, perhaps only specifically terrible in the 80s in Glasgow. And the truth is it was hard to be queer anywhere at the time. But Shuggie's, before we talk about the misogyny that Agnes faces or the homophobia that Shuggie faces, what I wanted to show is the narrowness of masculinity. Here are men who are doing, for the most part, incredibly dangerous jobs, and their way of being masculine is to be very hard working, hard fighting, hard drinking, hard loving men. But they're not often encouraged to express their own tender feelings or their vulnerability or their sadness. And so when you have a society as it was that has a very narrow expression of masculinity, you often get a narrow expression of femininity too. And then Agnes falls absolutely on the outside of that, but Shuggie is so far on the outside. I mean, one of the things that I'm often asked about is, in the book, even his brother and his grandmother try to change him in a way or try to alter his feminine nature. And they love him very deeply. I believe they love the boots of him. I believe these characters love each other, but they just cannot envisage a world where Shuggie can grow up to be a happy man and have a place on those streets where he could have a happy, fulfilling life. And so they're trying to help him to fit in.
I want to talk a little bit about Agnes. I probably overemphasized Shuggie in my introduction, but Agnes, to some degrees, as much Agnes and Shuggie are the dyad in the book that kind of drives us all the way through. What does alcohol do to and for Agnes?
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, Agnes, Agnes is a woman who, at the very beginning of the book, before she's an alcoholic, she's a lot of incredibly complicated things. She is very generous, very gregarious. She's surrounded by love and her friends. She's a friend, she's a foe, she's a mother, she's a lover, she's a wife. But she's also very hurt, and her husband is cheating on her, and her very humble, modest dreams are not going to pan out. And she starts to sort of realize this. At the beginning of the book, people around her think she's too much. Her mother calls her too much and sort yourself out and just sort of get back to the chapel. And Agnes has never for a minute in the book been too much. It's just the world around her is not enough. And that's a terrible place to be stuck. And so I think alcohol for Agnes does a lot of things. I think it numbs pain. I think it's escapism. think it helps her to cope. But one of the things I wanted to show within the book is that alcoholism is a very changeable, mutable disease because the effects are always different and people drink for different reasons. Sometimes Agnes drinks in the book to find a party, to have a good time. Then other times she wants to harm herself. Other times she just wants to be melancholy. She uses it to call forth really fiery rage within herself, where she calls up people from her past and she casts up things that happened 20 years ago. And that's part of what makes her so exhausting to love, both for Shug, her husband at the beginning, but also for her sons. Shuggie is always reading the weather in the room and trying to deal with her. And I wanted that sort of low hum of terror that Shuggie feels, even on good days with Agnes, to be something that the reader also felt.
I think both brothers kind of have that feeling. They just deal with it in such radically different ways. Can you Leek Alexander, who goes by Leek in the book, where does he fit into the family? What role does he wind up playing?
Yeah, Leek is the middle child in the family, and for me, he's actually my favorite character. He is a contrast to masculinity that's happening in the city. He is a very introspective, quiet, quite a ghostly young man, because he's learned to deal with the trauma of his life by sort of dislocating and sort of receding within to himself, vanishing almost. But for me, I was thinking, Thomas Hardy is a big influence on my writing. You see a lot of Tess and Agnes, but you also see a lot of Jude Foley in Leek. And Leek is a young man that is trying to turn the corner on the Thatcher years. He realizes this sort of manual labor isn't going to get him anywhere, and he's trying to get to art school. But his brother and his mother keep coming in his way and sort of blocking him from that. And yet he never tells them. He never casts it up to them. He never says, I didn't go because of you. He just makes the sacrifice. And for me, that's a really powerful thing for somebody to do for someone else. I think there's no bigger sort of way you can declare your love for someone than to sort of put your own future on ice for them. But he's also raising the stakes for Shuggie. You know, Catherine, very quickly, you know, part of the thing about loving an addict is there does come a point, I think, for a lot of people where you realize you cannot save them or you cannot help them, or this relationship you're in is also hurting you. And so one of the central questions of the book is, how far do you go to save the person you love the most? And everybody loves Agnes, but how far do you go to love that person before you have to save yourself? And so Leek is almost increasing the pressure on Shuggie in that way.
You mentioned being loved. Agnes is married twice. What were her two husbands like?
I've never been asked that question. Thank you. I myself grew up in, which sounds to everybody else just like a very ordinary thing, but I come from what in Glasgow is almost a mixed marriage. Half my family are Irish Catholics, the other half of my family are Protestants from the north of Scotland. And in the 70s and 80s, that was a marriage of divides. It's a city that has a lot of sectarian troubles. And it's not necessarily that it has sectarian troubles. It has the second largest Orange March after Belfast in Ireland. So that gives you a little bit of context. But we never really descended into that mass violence or that fight for rights that the Northern Irish people did. For us, sectarianism becomes a very recreational thing for young men, and it organizes gangs and crimes and things like that. But for young working class men, it's an identifier in a way. But Agnes's two husbands are very different. You know, she starts off by marrying within her religious denomination. She marries another Catholic, and he's a very good, very constant man that goes out and works a hard job and gives her what she wants. But he's dull, and he doesn't give her more than she wants. He has no aspiration to him. And so at the beginning of the book, she actually flees. She runs away from him because she's bored. And she takes her two children and she flees. But she flees into the arms of a Protestant. And she sees a Protestant, as we often did at the times, as someone who was a little bit more liberated, someone who was a bit shinier, a little bit more selfish in a way. And so there was a little bit more glamour to Protestants, I think. For some reason, we always associated them with being slightly better off, although that was an absolute myth. But it was just this sort of way we were raised to think. And so she runs away with Shug because she is absolutely attracted to his charisma. But then, of course, he turns out to be an absolutely terrible womanizer.
In the book, in terms of sort of relations between the sexes, and actually more frankly, sexual relations, the men seem mostly driven by the baser carnal desires, whereas the women seem mostly driven by survival. There's genuine passion at times. I mean, there's a reason why Agnes stayed with Shug and was so attached to him, but there's also a real sense of darkness and danger.
There is. Agnes puts up with terrible things from Shug, and I won't spoil it for readers, but you know, Shug is doing a lot of things with women behind Agnes's back, but he also uses her appallingly and gives her nowhere to put her own trauma. He does something really horrific to her in Blackpool, which is a seaside town, much like Atlantic City. It's probably the nearest comparison. But Agnes clings to her husband and she believes him when he lies to her, to the point where when he promises her a new house and a very humble thing, he promises her a front door of her own. She goes in for it and she falls for it hook, line and sinker. And he uses it in a way to absolutely destroy her. But Agnes, you know, what she wants, as well as a little bit of glamour and a little bit of a good time, she wants to be adored. And I think we all want that. And I think that would go a long way to like easing how she feels about herself. But also as a comment on women within the society at the time and what they were allowed to hope for and the independence they were allowed to have. First of all, the tent pole of the week was the man's wages, you know. Young girls like Agnes would be told to leave their father's side and move in with her husband and then put all their faith in their husband building a home and a life and children with them. And so when all that's upended on Agnes, and we have statistics that say that women from Agnes's social class at the time, only 0.003% of them went on to higher education, finished high school and went on to higher education. So the sense of independence for Agnes might not be there. And so men play a very sort of, a very dominating role in deciding her destiny.
You mentioned Agnes's desire to be adored, comes across so strongly in the book. And despite her alcoholism, you depict her as being being desirable, beautiful, strikingly beautiful even.
Yeah.
Does that turn out to be a bit of a double-edged sword for her?
It absolutely does. Agnes is an incredibly charismatic character, and even from a young girl, she's almost luminous against the grey cityscape. You know, people are just drawn to her in very funny ways. But she's absolutely charismatic, and she has a very powerful pride. You know, I grew up amongst women who, even when we didn't have things at home or there was some hurt that we had, they would never go over the front door without looking absolutely immaculate, looking the very best they could. And there was an awful lot of strength and power and pride in that. And I've always respected that. And so Agnes is the epitome of that for me. But what happens is Agnes takes that and it almost becomes an affectation or a crutch for her. And sometimes in communities, you know, it's a cliche about working class stories that there should be solidarity, working class communities come together and we power on through. And that can be true, but sometimes the solidarity can be used and unified against you to exclude you because you don't fit into that place. And Agnes is too glorious for it. You know, she's too, the women, it's a very human thing. When we see someone who is acting a bit above their station or who has a notion of themselves that's a little bit bigger than we think it should be, we want to pick at them. And Agnes is very quickly sort of picked at by the other women around her.
I was about to say, after she leaves Sidehill and moves to Pithead, the women of Pithead, it's almost an instant chemical dislike. And at the point where they make their decision about her, she's done nothing.
She's done nothing. And actually, their first question of her is, where's your man? Which one of these is your man? But she has done nothing, but she's presented these airs and graces. And actually in Scotland, we have a saying that's called all fur coat and no knickers, which is when someone is so invested on their exterior and like putting that world on, but on the inside, you know, there's things missing and you can imagine.
Yes.
But it's really, they see that, you know, first of all, you know, everything is standardized. The houses are all the same. The wages that are coming in or not coming in are all the same. You know, everyone's going to the same chapel. It's a very standard thing. So when you see someone disrupting that with this magnificent sense of self-worth, then people come out almost like attacking a virus and want to pick at it. And it happens to Shuggie too, in a way.
I think maybe in a weird way, I think it's almost one of the things that binds them. They know they're different.
Yeah, they do. And Agnes keeps trying to reinforce it for Shuggie to help him reject the shame and pick his head up and, you know, and carry his head high. And it's a very powerful thing, but it infects her sons and especially Shuggie in a way that really compounds terrible things for the boy.
I want to get to some of the questions, but you brought something up about her bucking Shuggie up. Can you talk about, there's a wonderful scene that it doesn't give much away because you've just said it. I'm glad you did. Where Agnes and Shuggie eat a lot of sweets and watch some trashy TV. Mm-hmm. And then Agnes asks Shuggie to dance for her. Mm-hmm. He does, and a remarkable scene ensues. Can you give us a piece of that as it relates to the last thing you said in terms of Agnes trying, despite all of her flaws, despite her disease, to support her son?
That's right. Agnes has her husband's abandoned her, and she's going on her first date, and she's gloriously sober, and she is really, you know, sort of picked herself up by the bootstraps, and she is going on her first date, and she says to her young son, who they don't even have a word for queer, but she says, please teach me how to dance how the kids do. And of course, Shuggie is such a flamboyant young kid that he teaches her the routine. He teaches his mother the routine to Janet Jackson's Control, thinking this is how adults must dance in nightclubs because this is what he sees on television. But as he's teaching her to dance, the children are passing along. It's a very low-lying housing estate, and they're watching from outside, and they start to mock him. And he's in the middle of his routine, and his mother's been watching him, and suddenly he realizes he's being watched. And he turns to his mother and he's petrified and he's broken. And his mother says, just keep dancing. And he says, I can't. And she says, yes, you can. And she, she G's him on and she G's him on to keep dancing. And he says in that moment, he suddenly understands where his mother's power lies, because she goes through these terrible, horrible things and she disgraces herself and is disgraced by people. And yet every single day she digs herself up and she makes herself look like a queen. And there was a real power in that for him. And so that's really her teaching him to carry on.
I needed to put the book down for a minute after that scene, so thank you for that. Wendy and Shandu have a couple of questions that are kind of related. You mentioned your visual arts background, and then you mentioned not being an MFA writer, and they both kind of want to know, where did the writing come from, and how does your sort of visual acuity and visual skill, how did it inform the writing of this book specifically?
Yeah, actually, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I'm a product of the British class system. And I think it was just seen as something that boys like me shouldn't do. Of the 300 kids that started high school with me, only 12 of us graduated with enough to go on to higher education. And I'm not condemning that. I'm just letting you know what was going on in the neighborhood around us. And so I didn't really start to read books until I was a young man. And instead I was funneled into textiles, because textiles was a good place for a flamboyant gay kid to go, but it was also incredibly pragmatic and practical, because what does Scotland make other than cloth and whiskey? We make some of the most beautiful varied cloth in the world. And so that's what really I went through art school. I learned how to be a textile designer, and that's my career that brought me to New York. But in 2008, I sat down to begin writing and Shuggie and some other things, because I had become a huge reader and I'd always wanted to write. It was something that, it was a dream furloughed for me. But actually, when I began to start writing, I felt very keenly the lack of an MFA, because I felt incredibly inferior, and I kept my writing to myself for several years because I didn't know if it was any good. I didn't know if I was doing it right. I didn't, who am I to be able to write? I had a huge chip on my shoulder from my youth. And funnily enough, when I started to intersect it or to rely on my visual skills, for me, I felt a real sort of seat of power, because the more I've been telling stories visually my entire life and creating worlds for people to step into and to be transported away. And when I started to lean on that in the writing of Shuggie, then I suddenly felt things click in place for me. And not only that, but I hoped it would create a real immersive world for the reader, where the reader could step in and see what I was seeing and feel what I was feeling. And so that was really how I lent on my visual background.
Another question they have here is, again, it's sort of a writing question. Did the main idea of the book evolve? This is from Sierra. Did you have a particular theme in mind while you were writing the book, or did it evolve? And then from Kimberly, what was the most surprising thing you learned in creating the book?
Yeah, great questions. Well, to answer the first question first, actually the book didn't evolve, it just distilled in a way. So I knew what was going to happen with Shuggie and Agnes. I think because so much of it is drawn from my own life, and I wanted to pay a dignity to mothers who suffered and mothers who struggled, but also mothers, I can't spoil the book for you, but things that happen, I wanted to pay that. So I knew how we were coming in and how we were going out. Funnily enough, one of the reasons why the book took me 10 years is because it was actually a lesson in empathy for me as a human before I was a writer. When you're a child of trauma, and that trauma can be bullying or addiction or grief or loss or poverty, then the things happen to you and you have no control over it, but you don't often get a chance to reflect on why is that happening. You just have to deal with it. You have to cope. And so when I sat down to write Shuggie Bain, it was an opportunity for me to think about, why did my mother descend into addiction? Why did women turn to alcohol? By the way, and they did in droves. One of the things about Shuggie Bain is this is not just a family in crisis. There's a lot of people across the city in crisis. And so it allowed me to go back, and it was incredibly cathartic. It was, it hurt a lot, but it was cathartic ultimately to go back and not just think about the things that had happened, but why had they happened? Why is there sectarianism? Why did men treat women like that? Why do little boys feel like they have to ostracize a young queer boy? What do they see? And so to understand why characters would act as they would was good for me as a human and as a writer. And that's a big reason why it took 10 years.
I don't think that 10 years is all that unusual to write a 400-page novel from what I've talked to other, but I can imagine it must have felt like a mountain at times.
Yeah, I don't think it is that unusual. And I think also there's a pleasure in it. You know, I wasn't hurrying to get it published. I didn't know if it would be a book for the first half of its life. And part of the reason why it took 10 years is because I didn't want to say goodbye. I had to actually get the book published because I had to say goodbye. I couldn't move on creatively because I would go back and I would embroider in a scene with Agnes and I would just spend time with them. And so creatively, I wasn't progressing. And so publishing the book was necessary.
So you talk about actually, and I love the way you put it, spending time with Agnes. One of the things that comes across with Shuggie, with Agnes, with Leek, with Catherine, even with Shug himself, the Catholic, her first husband, is you really give your main characters, and really kind of, even one of the things I love about it is the characters that kind of flit into the book and flit out all have a real sense of a full being. They're not just signifiers. How important was it to you as you spent time with these characters and came to, I don't think it's too strong to say love them, to make sure that you gave them the full spectrum from good to bad? And how did you make sure you had that balance so that they were presented in the end as real believable characters?
Yeah, I felt I couldn't write about them if I didn't care for them, because I wasn't interested in just creating a bad person doing bad things. And especially as a kid of someone who was an addict, I realized very quickly how reduced women can be by when they suffer from alcoholism. They're discarded very quickly and they're known as just an alcoholic or that thing. And especially in a community, you know, it's in a very small community, that happens incredibly quickly. And so what I really tried to do was to show all the layers behind Agnes and behind Ginty and behind everybody that was there, because I never understood alcoholics as just an alcoholic. They're people and they have desires and dreams and wishes and flaws and hurt that they carry through them when or they're not drinking, when they are or when they're not. And so it was just, I tried my hardest to make them feel as rich as that. But Shug is the closest I think we come to a man who just does bad things relentlessly. And even then, you know, I tried to show how exhausted he was by his wife and her sort of addiction and her needs and those other things. And then also how he's not ever held to task by the community around him. He gets to do these things and there's no reproach for him. There's no outcome. He's allowed to do it. And there's also nowhere for the trauma that he creates to go. It's not like Agnes gets up and can go to a therapist or go to the police and say, my husband just did this to me. That was not the time for that. That was not the social class of the place. And so Shug is just very empowered to be a bad person.
You present a potential alternative to Shug and to her first husband. I'm trying to remember, McGowan was his last name. Why don't I can't remember his first name?
Brendan, thank
you. You present towards the latter half of the book, a man, Agnes goes out and gets an evening job. And she meets someone that she refers to as the Redheaded Ox. Who is he and what role does he wind up playing in her life?
Yeah, he becomes a love for Agnes, and he's another taxi driver. Her first husband or his second husband, Shug, is a taxi driver. And I was commenting on men sort of racing around the city almost like knights and having this influence on women. That was the symbol for me there. And, you know, Eugene is a very upstanding ex-miner. He's a Catholic. He's a very good man, fundamentally. He doesn't have any hidden agenda. And Agnes falls in love with him. And, you know, he believes, here is this very beautiful woman, and here am I, a fine man. I can fix anything. And it's a bit of the hero complex that men can have, you know. He sees this woman who's a little bit broken and he thinks, oh, now that I'm in your life, everything will be great. Everything will be fine. And so he actually takes her out and he sees her next to other alcoholics and he thinks, you're not an alcoholic, you know, you don't look like them. But of course Agnes is. And then he does some things that sort of begin the end for Agnes, let's put it that way. But yeah, he has this really big hero complex. But one of the fun things he does is he takes her to a country and western club in the centre of Glasgow. And what a lot of people might not know is, like, Glaswegians love country and western. A little bit of it is the storytelling and the narration that's in the song, and I think another bit's the guns.
It's because Eugene actually he's the sheriff.
He's the sheriff. He's a fake sheriff, yeah.
Right.
And so he wears like a little plastic badge, and everyone gives him the respect as though he was a sheriff. And here he is, just this taxi driver.
Speaking about a comment about masculinity,
Yeah.
there's a couple of questions that are specifically, you mentioned the Glasgow and country music. They're not about Glasgow and country music, but they are about Glasgow then and now. So the two questions are from Andrea: how has Glasgow changed since the Thatcher period? And did the Scottish independence movement gain momentum because of that time? And another question, how has your family reacted to the book? And would you ever consider moving back to Glasgow?
I'll answer the last one first. Glasgow is still my heart and my home, and my family are still on the streets that I write about. And I think they're incredibly proud of the book. And in fact, Glasgow painted a mural to Shuggie Bain this week on one of our most iconic landmarks. Totally surprised me and totally floored me and blew me away, but it's really beautiful. They had a competition with the Glasgow School of Art there, and some of the students came up with an outstanding mural. Yeah, you know, Glasgow has changed entirely, and then it's not changed at all. It has always been a place of contrast. It's always been a place of humanity. You know, there is camaraderie with violence. There is humor with sadness. Those things will endure. That's the Glaswegian spirit. There's a resiliency to it. It's good to see from an employment and an economic point of view that the city is absolutely soaring. You know, it's always been a creative hotbed and of information and manufacturing. And so the city looks phenomenal and is doing incredibly well. But as in America, as in the UK, there are still a third of kids living under the poverty line. And that's not a specifically Glaswegian thing, but it's a British thing. It's an American thing. And so Shuggie and Agnes are just characters from the margins. And people still live in the margins in life. And that's true in Glasgow, it's true in Birmingham, true in Newcastle, it's true in Detroit, true in New York. I live on 7th Street, it's true in New York. And so in a lot of ways, some things never change.
Diane wanted to know, and I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm gonna let you answer it. Do you really need to know about Glasgow to appreciate this book more?
Well, no, I don't think you need to know a single thing about it. I think what's the unifying thing about the book, hopefully, is the love and the hope. And I think actually when the book was out for submission, Diane, publishers thought people would need to know about Glasgow in order to care. And what actually the publication of the book and sort of how it's doing has reminded people is actually you don't need to know. You just need to, you know, come to it and want to read this story, I suppose. Have a bit of empathy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes that less important in the book is that there's a real sense of physical space and how it shapes people. You write at one point, rain was the natural state of Glasgow. It kept the grass green and the people pale and bronchial. How important was getting, both in terms of getting it right just to be accurate in a sense of what the character is experiencing, but also to communicate that to readers? How important was that to you?
It was critical for me, but it was most important to really create the world for the characters. I didn't have any concept of who a reader was and what they might want to know from me or what they would need to know. But I needed to make sure that Agnes and Shuggie's world felt real to them and that it was all surrounding for them. And so I spent a lot of time with the details and really world creation. But Glasgow in a lot of ways is a character in the book because Glasgow herself goes through a huge upheaval within the novel. You know, we see her very proud at the beginning, we see her go through a decay, and then towards the end of the book, as the characters move back into the heart of the city, there is that sort of renewal of hope. But it was a tumultuous time in the city's history as well, you know, with all the reorganization and the unemployment. And much of the city as well was torn down. And so that kind of mirrors what's going on internally with Agnes.
couple other questions from the good people watching. And again, thank you everybody for your great
Yeah,
questions.
thank you.
There are so many questions that we could go on for hours, but unfortunately, we only fed the meter for a certain amount of time. Nikki wanted to know, there were apparently a fairly large number of rejections for the book. Were you surprised at the accolades and the success it's had? And a couple of people have asked about a film being made from the book. My question, which I did have in regard to the film, is, do you worry that someone will screw it up?
First of all, Glenn, you love a compound question. There's like 6 questions in that one question.
So
The first
rejections, unexpected success, the film.
You're like testing my memory more than anything else. The rejections are part of a writer's life. They're hard when you go through them at the beginning, but every writer has to learn how to deal with rejection. What I was certain is I didn't change a word of the book through the rejection period. And then to answer the sort of the accolades thing, I think I was surprised. And Shuggie sort of receiving all of these accolades has changed how many people the book has connected with, and that's the most wonderful thing about it. But the funny thing about some of the rejections is the editors that were rejecting the book wrote at the top of the rejection letter, "This will win the Booker. I just don't know how to publish it." I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious. I received several of those. This will win.
Which is actually a really a good thing for them to say, that they can't serve the book.
They can't serve the book. They didn't know how to connect this family with an American readership or an audience. What shelf does it go on? How do we do that? And so you're absolutely right. And we always talk about the rejection as a thing that's sort of based on the book, but sometimes a publisher says, "I don't know what to do with this," and that's a very noble thing to do, I think. And then your last part of the question, you do have
So a couple of people asked about the fact that it appears that there's going to be a film made of the book.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit? And then my question is, how worried are you that they're going to screw it up?
You're always worried about it, but one of the reasons I signed on to write the adaptation myself is because I thought it was a really fascinating opportunity to try and give more dimension to the characters. I was very aware that a novel to a screenplay are very different things. They need to achieve different things. And so I wanted to just really be there with the characters and protect them. But one of the things I'm most excited about is giving Leek a whole backstory, or just more of a story, I think, because I think he's a fascinating character, if I do say so myself. But he fascinates me, and so I wanted to give him some screen time. But one of the things that will be really interesting is this. It might never make it to screen. I think that's the way of these things, but it might. And at the moment, Stephen Daldry is attached to direct, who of course just directed The Crown. And I think it'll be fascinating, because part of why I wanted to write the book was to keep showing people what happened in the Thatcher years, and not always focus on sort of what it was like in London and what it was like in these very sort of insular circles, but how it really affected real families. And so having Stephen having done The Crown and then hopefully doing Shuggie will be fascinating.
You mentioned the relationships that Agnes kind of immediately has when she moves to Pithead. Beyond the circle of people who didn't like her, in Pithead, she also has a lot of enablers. How do they interact with her? What do they get from her, and what do they do to her?
Yeah, I'd always known actually Alcoholics Anonymous and people suffering with addiction, because it was a time, and it still exists, where lots of people were struggling in different ways. I knew there to be this sort of dark, hidden society, or this subculture almost. And so Agnes in the book intersects with this in different ways. She gets a lot of support from Alcoholics Anonymous. It puts her on the right track. But she also has alcoholics around her who do enable her, or who do, when she's feeling strong, sort of pull her back in, or manipulate her, or use her vulnerability. And I'd just known that to be true. I'd known it to be a very complicated, nuanced relationship. And especially sometimes when a woman is suffering with addiction, then people really prey on that vulnerability. There's something slightly more vulnerable about a mother and a woman in that position than perhaps a man. And men and women sort of rush forward to see what they can get from that.
Shanu wanted to ask about we talked about rejection, we talked about accolades, which are really two sides of the same coin if you're writing a book. You hope to get the latter, you will definitely get the former unless you thread an incredible needle. Is there, for those who are watching who are also writers or interested in writing, do you have a piece of advice you want to give people who are hungering to write a book or writing a book now?
Yeah, I mean, as a debut novelist, my advice perhaps doesn't go so deep. But one thing that always strikes me is I always hear people say, read everything you can, read everything you can. And I think that's true. But I also think you should live as much as you can. And I think you should live and put your feet inside the shoes of the characters you're trying to write about as much as you can. I see a lot of writers, and I'm guilty of it myself sometimes, where I feel like I can synthesize the world through other literature. And the truth is we have to also sort of walk some hard miles as writers to really understand how things feel. But I would say one of my pieces of advice is if you're thinking about writing a book and you don't know how to start, the first thing to do is maybe don't tell yourself you're going to write a book. It's about how you want to take the journey. You know, if you say you're going to drive to California, or if you say you're just going to go for a very long drive, I would tell you to just tell yourself you're going for a very long drive and then see what comes and what you explore, at least for the first draft, because a first draft is really a conversation just with yourself. And whereas if you say you're going to write a book, then you place so much pressure on yourself from the get-go that can sometimes be insurmountable and can mute you and keep you away from the page. So commit to writing and see where the journey takes you.
Yeah, there are people who, when they go back to exercise, decide to run a marathon first. That's
yeah.
Probably, if you can analogize it, I think, to a lot of different things.
Yeah. And if you can cope with that pressure, that's great. It wasn't something that I could do, and so that worked for me.
Yeah. Before we sort of move into the home stretch, I do want to remind people that the book is available. The good people from National Arts Club have posted the link. There's a 2-book minimum. If you already have the book, remember you also have friends who may not have the book. They need it. I'm sure there's some giving holiday coming up soon, so 2 books, please. And we'll be able to get them a book plate. So that's a bonus. So do you want to talk a little bit about the future, both from the book and from you? You write plainly at one point about Shuggie, with no friends to speak of. Yet by the end of the book, he makes at least what appears to be one true friend. How do he and Leanne meet, and what binds them so deeply?
Oh, Leanne's such a little soul. They meet towards the end of the book, and at first they're thrown together almost to have a romantic relationship or to start courting or dating. And it comes through when, first of all, Leanne discovers that Shuggie just isn't going to be anything he desires or wants to kiss and be with a girl. And then they start to bond through their shared trauma. And it turns out they both have mothers at home who are having a really difficult time. And Leanne almost is slightly more mature in her outlook. She sees it as first of all, sees the humor in it, where Shuggie can't quite yet see the humor in it. And she also understands that she's kind of powerless. She'll do what she can, but she can't alter her mother's fate. And that's a real revelation and a turning point for Shuggie. Just first of all, this is his first true friend, and also that she is going through the same thing with him. And then without spoiling the end of the book, Leanne is pivotal. She is really Shuggie's North Star. And that is a comment on sort of the transformative power of female friendships for gay men. And I knew that to be true in my own life, but my own life was saved by my female friends and by the women that came into my life as a young man. And Leanne really does that for Shuggie, and they sort of, they go dancing into the day, and it's a hopeful thing. But she also plays in a way sort of the ghost of Christmas future for Shuggie, because her mother is still suffering, and Shuggie gets to see that and gets a little bit of distance. And so at several points in the book, there are forks in the road where Shuggie or Leek could see what their life could be if they took the other path. And Leanne does that for Shuggie too.
What I love about, and I'm reasonably certain this was a choice, you'll let me know if I'm wrong. I think in other books, we would have met Leanne halfway through the book. She only appears in the last 40 pages.
Mhm.
And yet I think it carries an extra power and carries us, as you allude to,
Mhm.
you have an idea that if Shuggie is not going to be perfect, that he's got something to hook into suddenly, which
Yeah.
we didn't have until she meets him.
Yeah, and I think the people who come to save us or to come and give us love and support, you know, they don't always come when you need them, when you expect them to come. They come when you need them, and Leanne really shows up right at the right moment for Shuggie in lots of ways. And she also helps him to embrace his sexuality. He's just starting to blossom by the end of the book, and it's hinted at rather than explicitly said. But she sees him, and she's the first person who sees him and doesn't try to change him. And so she's incredibly powerful in his life, and we can imagine they're going to be lifelong friends.
You talk about how it begins to blossom through. I mean, I think his queerness is something that is alluded to throughout the book, and it's not hidden in any way. It's not overt in any way. Did you want to kind of match his own experience of learning about it with how you presented it as he goes through the story?
Yeah, I wanted him to lack a sort of self-awareness because I wanted him just to be sort of so traumatized in a way. And I had also, it was a comment on how, you know, when Shuggie is first sort of told he's different by his grandmother or by the boys in school, he has no sense of his self. You know, he has no sense of sexuality or desire. He is just this soul that likes this blonde dolly and is a little bit precocious. And he doesn't know he's different until he's told he's different. And that's really sort of his journey through this. He's othered very quickly in the same or similar way that Agnes is othered by the women around her. And, you know, it's really about how femininity was under attack. And it isn't about his sexuality because he hasn't quite gotten there yet. He hasn't voiced any sexual desires. It comes. But at first it's just about, why is this little boy acting like, you know, effeminate?
And you know, it's interesting to see how that aspect of his personality is mostly reflected by people's reaction to him. There's an incredible cruelty that anyone who grew up as a youth anywhere is familiar with, whether they were gay or not, but it's certainly especially a sting for anyone who became aware of their sexuality being different from most people's. So a couple of people have asked in the QA, and I think we can, before I will remind people to buy their books, please, please. That's how authors actually live, by people buying their work. A couple of people have asked, what's next for you? What is the work now? And do you feel pressure to follow up something that seems to be pretty universally beloved?
Actually, I'm glad you asked the question that way, because I do feel a bit of pressure to make sure that the next characters I write about, people feel as complicated in all the complicated ways they do about Agnes and Shuggie. And that's where I feel the pressure. Lots of people ask me if I feel pressure from the booker, and actually I don't, because you're powerless to that. That'll happen or it won't. The only power you have is to write the book that you have to write. And so the pressure I feel is about creating something that feels as real as Agnes and Shuggie. But I am excited to announce that my next novel will be published next spring. It's a book that I've been working on for 6 years. It is a book about two boys, two young men who fall in love in 1990s Glasgow, but they are separated by the territorial or the sectarian divide. So almost like a Romeo and Juliet, they are caught up in all this gang violence and all this representing these families, but really all they want to be is in love. One of the young boys is sent to the north of Scotland in order to make a man out of him, and it has disastrous consequences for everybody in the book.
So it sounds like you have not yet exhausted Glasgow as a setting.
I think that's only a comment that someone maybe not from Glasgow would ask, because we're always writing from the center of our experiences, and so to you it's a little bit other, but for me it's the core of who I am.
I didn't mean it in the sense of other. It's
no.
It feels like there's, you know, obviously a place like Glasgow is inexhaustible for stories.
Yeah, I think hard times lead to a lot of creativity, and you know, they give you a ton of inspiration. And the city in the 70s and 80s went through an incredibly hard time. And so I think I'm always just trying to turn those ugly things into beautiful things. And it's a good way to deal with trauma, and it's a good way to answer societal questions. So Glasgow's always part of my inspiration.
I think you've turned in this book some ugly things, some difficult things into beauty, into real beauty, and it was such a great experience to read the book, and really a wonderful experience to speak to you and hear you talk about it tonight. So first, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who's listened to us tonight. And again, I apologize for not getting to all the questions. There were some very good questions I couldn't get to. We shall have to do this again next year when the second book comes out, and there'll be new questions to ask. So everyone, again, please buy your book. You will not regret buying your multiple copies of this book. Friends will thank you for giving it to them. And once again, thank you all for being here tonight, and everyone have a wonderful evening. Douglas, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming and spending your night with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.